We're going to look at three factors. We're going to get an update on the national minimum wage mission. We're going to consider some economic indicators, and we're going to consider some collective bargaining indicators. Most of you should be aware when talking about the national minimum wage that as of 2022, the Commission has equalized all other minimums in South Africa, apart from the minimum rates for the expanded public works program. All on now, we may finally talk of a single national minimum wage, since the wages of domestic workers and farm workers were equalized. That level now sits at 23 Rand and 19 cents per hour, or 12 Rand 75 for the EPWP. And this amounts to about 4,000 Rand a month for a 40-hour week. And in the case of the EPWP, shade over 2,200 a month. The national minimum wage, the main rate, has increased by 16% since its inception in January 2019. All right. Let us consider a handful of economic indicators to understand where we're located when we consider bargaining in the South African economy. This first slide is just to provide some perspective and to put current GDP in perspective. This is a history of GDP growth for all the way back from 94 to the current day. Those of you who remember the so-called financial crisis of 2009, you can see that it is a dip, but compared to the more recent crash around COVID, it's really, really small. And I think this just serves to put what's happened in the last couple of years in perspective. This was an apocalyptic crash of the economy. So if it feels like a special situation, it should, because it really is. The main graph you're looking at here looks at GDP from Q1 2020, the first quarter of 2020, which is really important because that is our last pre-pandemic quarter. And then it looks at the change to Q3 of 2021, so late last year. By sector, what you will see is that it is only agriculture and personal services that have recovered to above pre-COVID levels. Mining, business services, government services, close. And then a range of sectors still haven't recovered to those levels, and construction performing especially badly. In the top right-hand corner, I've just posted a little update. Stats SA just released GDP numbers. These are annualized changes to Q2. So in other words, over the last year, so Q1 2021 to Q1 2022. It's just useful to understand these are the contributions to GDP, what the sector, so manufacturing making a strong contribution, which is good to see. Mining and construction still not doing very well. A quick look at mining numbers. This graph is a little complicated, but let me walk you through it very quickly. We're looking at four commodity groups: coal, gold, iron ore, and platinum group metals. And then for each one, I've banded coal. There's two readings on it. The first is volume, and the second is value. I've put some little line here to show you the trend line, and it tracks it from early 2020 to the end of last year. And what we find for each of the commodity groups is that production is generally down for coal, gold, slightly up for iron ore, volume also up for PGMs. But in all cases, the value of that production is up. And this is, of course, driven by higher commodity prices. So even where production is down, the sales value is up on previous levels because of higher prices. So a mixed reading from mining. Manufacturing, very important part of our economy, a relatively mixed bag, but I think what it tells you is that for the most part, we've seen slight increases from Q1 2021. The notable exception is transport equipment, which is quite sharply down on the past, and the others are relatively flat. A quick look at trade, imports and exports. I put a red line here to show you where the pandemic hits, and you see trade in terms of imports and exports falls off the cliff when the pandemic lands. Has since recovered quite strongly to, well, certainly in the case of exports, to above pre-pandemic levels, and imports pretty much at pre-pandemic levels. We're running a small trade surplus, which is a good thing. I'm not sure that that's going to last very long. All right, that was a hand. Oh, I beg your pardon, we're not quite done. A note on unemployment. The point I want to make here is that, look, we know that we lost a lot of jobs. We know that certainly formal employment has recovered since that calamitous fall in employment. The point I'm making here is that our two major surveys, the quarterly labor force survey and the quarterly employment survey, give slightly different readings of unemployment. We should take current unemployment numbers with a little bit of caution, especially since Stats SA changed its methodology in the QLFS to telephonic interviews. And there is a concern, I guess, that the survey is currently not as representative to be. And the point here is, I believe as a trade unionist, as anyone within the movement, we should take every opportunity we can find to make sure that Stats SA has the budget it needs to run proper surveys. Its budget was cut by about 25% in 2022. This does not bode well. And anybody who says that we don't have the money needs to understand that the cost of Stats SA properly is triple the benefits of a good quarterly labor force survey. It helps us, you know, as trade unions, as policymakers, as any kind of social actor, take every opportunity you can to lobby for Stats SA to be funded properly. Right, that was then a handful of economic indicators. And now we consider a handful of bargaining indicators. There is set the trend between 2017 and 2021, with the exception of agriculture, which has remained relatively flat. We see settlement levels falling over the last period quite significantly in bargaining terms across all sectors. So clearly we can see, I think, the effect of things. One is the pandemic itself, and the second is that inflation up until recently has been falling, has been relatively low, and inflation is of course quite central to bargaining. A quick snapshot of 2022. Look, this is a small sample, so you should take it with a grain of salt. On this vertical axis, we're tracking the settlement levels, and on the horizontal axis at the bottom, these are the kind of wage levels. And we have a median settlement level in 22 of 6.5%. It does range between 3 and almost 10%. But the settlement level in the middle of all those settlements is 6.5% so far, from what we can tell. A quick note on inflation. Any negotiator needs to have an opinion of what is happening with inflation. This tells you a little bit about the trend over the last 5 years or so. What we see is inflation falling consistently from 2017 to a low average of 3.3% in 2020. It has since started climbing. A rough estimate of average inflation this year so far is about 5.8%, although the last release was, I think, at 5.9%, so that average looks, to my mind, to be set to climb. If you look at South Africa and you look at the globe, it looks to me like there are a lot of inflationary pressures, and so there's every, I think, likelihood that inflation will breach that 6% threshold that South Africa has been pursuing for many years now. I don't think that's terribly contentious. I've outlined that first point there. I would say that a lot of the pain, especially in the form of job losses, should be behind us now. And industries and sectors are recovering off low bases. And in many instances, they have shed a significant amount of labor. One would hope then that, that pressure should be released from the negotiating table to some degree, although in a very tragic way. I do think employer sentiment is very weak. Expectations are set low, and the public sector appears to be role modeling settlements below 5%, about 5%. So there's further downward pressure for negotiators.